A young girl stood frozen in a room filled with the world's most brilliant scholars, her heart pounding as hundreds of eyes turned toward her. Moments earlier, she had been invisible, just another servant pouring tea and staying silent in the shadows. But now, after daring to speak up against a famous expert who had mocked her in front of everyone, she was about to reveal a truth that would shake the foundation of everything these academics thought they knew. What happened next didn't just change her life forever. It rewrote an entire chapter of forgotten history and brought tears to people who had lost hope decades ago. The secret she carried wasn't written in any textbook, and no university professor had ever studied it. It was a gift passed down through whispered words from her grandfather, a war hero whose sacrifice had been buried in silence for 70 years. This isn't just a story about courage or intelligence. It's about how the most powerful truths sometimes live in the quietest hearts, waiting for the right moment to be heard. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you enjoy stories that make you feel something real, stories that remind you why human connection and bravery matter, then do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I promise you, the stories we share here are different. They're not just entertainment. They're experiences that stay with you long after the video ends. And trust me, what you're about to hear today will leave you speechless. Drop a comment right now and tell me if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who thought they were better than you. Have you ever known something important but were too afraid to speak up? Share your thoughts, because this story is for everyone who's ever been underestimated. Now let's dive into a tale so unbelievable, so moving that by the end you'll understand why silence can sometimes be the loudest prison, and why one girl's voice became the key that unlocked it. The grand ballroom was a cathedral of intelligence, filled wall to wall with the kind of people who wore their education like armor. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting golden light on tailored suits and silk dresses. Conversations floated through the air in a dozen different languages, each word carefully chosen, each sentence polished to perfection. These were linguists, historians, and scholars who had dedicated their entire lives to understanding how humans communicate. They debated the origins of ancient scripts, argued over grammatical structures that hadn't been spoken in thousands of years, and laughed at inside jokes only they could understand. It was the annual gathering of the International Language Symposium, where the brightest minds came together to share discoveries that would be published in prestigious journals and discussed in universities around the world. But moving silently through this sea of brilliance was someone nobody noticed. A 12-year-old girl whose only job was to make sure nobody's teacup ran empty. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she balanced the heavy silver tray. Careful not to let the delicate porcelain rattle and draw attention, her mother had given her strict instructions that morning. Be quiet, be quick, and whatever you do, don't look anyone in the eye. They had this job because they needed it desperately, and one mistake could cost them everything. So Clara learned to become a ghost, moving from table to table, refilling cups and clearing plates while conversations continued around her as if she didn't exist. She wore a plain black dress with a crisp white apron, her blonde hair pulled back tightly, her blue eyes always cast downward. To everyone in that room, she was part of the background, as unremarkable as the wallpaper or the carpet beneath their expensive shoes. But while her hands worked automatically, her mind was somewhere else entirely, soaking in every word she heard like a sponge absorbing water. She couldn't help herself. Languages fascinated her in a way she couldn't explain to anyone. When she heard someone arguing in French, her brain automatically translated it. When two professors debated in German, she understood every nuance. It wasn't something she studied in school. It was something that just happened naturally, as if her mind were built to catch words and hold onto them forever. But more than anything else, she loved the melody of different tongues, the way each language had its own rhythm and soul. Her grandfather had taught her that. He used to say that languages were like rivers, each one flowing differently, but all of them carrying the stories of the people who spoke them. And now, as she moved through this room of experts, she felt like she was swimming in a river of knowledge, invisible but present, ignored but listening. Then everything changed. Clara found herself standing near the front of the room where a massive screen displayed an image that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a photograph of an ancient-looking stone tablet, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to dance before her eyes. The marks were angular and sharp, arranged in lines that looked almost like poetry carved into rock. Around the screen, a group of the most respected scholars at the symposium stood in a tight circle, their voices tense with frustration, She recognized the man at the center immediately. Everyone did. Dr. Alistair Finch was a legend, a polyglot who claimed to speak more than 30 languages fluently. He had written books, given lectures in packed auditoriums, and appeared on television programs where he dazzled audiences with his ability to switch between tongues as easily as most people breathed. He was tall, imposing, with silver hair swept back dramatically, and a voice that could silence a room with a single word. Right now, though, that famous voice was edged with irritation. Dr. Finch gestured sharply at the image on the screen, his confidence cracking at the edges. This should be simple, he insisted, but there was doubt creeping into his tone. The symbols don't match anything in our database, a younger scholar responded nervously, adjusting his glasses. We've cross-referenced every known ancient script and found nothing conclusive. Dr. Finch waved away the concern with an arrogant flick of his hand. That's because you're not thinking properly, Marcus. Every writing system has roots. This is clearly a derivative of something pre-Aryan, probably isolated in some mountain region. Once we identify the grammatical core, translation will follow naturally. He spoke with the kind of certainty that left no room for disagreement. But Clara could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed impatiently against his side. He was worried, even if he refused to admit it. Clara's eyes stayed locked on those symbols. Her heart began to beat faster, not from fear but from recognition. She knew those marks. She had seen them before, drawn on scraps of paper by her grandfather's weathered hands during long summer evenings on their porch. He would sketch them carefully while telling her stories, his voice low and soft, weaving tales of mountains that held memories and rivers that carried secrets. He called it the tongue of the silent mountains, and he taught it to her in fragments, never explaining where it truly came from, only that it was important, precious, something worth protecting. She remembered tracing those symbols with her finger, sounding out the words he taught her, feeling the strange melody of the language wrap around her mind like a warm blanket. And now here they were, projected on a screen in front of the world's greatest linguistic minds, and nobody understood them. Nobody except her. She shouldn't have stopped. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, warning her to stay invisible, to keep moving, to never draw attention. But her feet refused to obey. She stood there transfixed, staring at the tablet while the scholars argued over meanings that made no sense. They were trying to force the symbols into familiar patterns, treating them like a puzzle that could be solved with logic and analysis. But Clara knew better. This language didn't work like that. It wasn't about grammar rules or phonetic structures. It was about feeling, about images and metaphors woven together into something beautiful and alive. Her grandfather had taught her that you don't just read this language, you experience it. You let the words paint pictures in your mind, and only then do they reveal their truth. Her mother's sharp whisper cut through her thoughts like a knife. "Clara, what are you doing?" Helen appeared at her side, her face tight with worry. She grabbed her daughter's arm gently but firmly, trying to steer her away from the group of professors. "You're staring at them. Get back to the kitchen before someone notices." "But Mama," Clara whispered, her eyes still glued to the screen. "I know what those symbols mean. I've seen them before." Helen's grip tightened, panic flashing across her face. "Don't be ridiculous, sweetie. You're imagining things. Those are ancient writings from scholars. You can't possibly know what they say. Now come with me before we both lose our jobs." She pulled Clara away from the screen, her movements quick and desperate, but Clara's mind was already racing. She knew exactly what that line of text said, and she knew that Dr. Finch, despite all his fame and expertise, was completely wrong. They retreated toward the kitchen doors, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping away. Her grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, reminding her that words have power, that truth matters, that staying silent when you know something important is the same as letting that truth die. She glanced back over her shoulder one last time and saw Dr. Finch pointing at a specific sequence of symbols, declaring with absolute authority that once they cracked this phrase, everything would fall into place. His colleagues nodded in agreement, impressed by his confidence. But Clara could see the phrase clearly from where she stood, and she knew with absolute certainty that his interpretation was backwards. He was reading it as a map, looking for directions and landmarks, when in reality it was poetry, a meditation on nature and memory that had nothing to do with geography. In the sweltering heat of the kitchen, surrounded by the clatter of dishes and the sharp scent of baking bread, Helen checked her daughter's apron with trembling hands. smoothing it down as if trying to smooth away the danger of what had just happened. "You cannot do that again, Clara," she said firmly, her eyes searching her daughter's face. "Do you understand me? In there, we are nothing. We are help. We serve and we stay silent. That's how we survive." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she wasn't making things up, that her grandfather had taught her a real language that nobody else seemed to know. But she could see the fear in her mother's eyes, the exhaustion in her shoulders, and she understood. They needed this job. They needed the money. One wrong move, one moment of standing out, and they could lose everything. But as Clara picked up another tray and pushed back through the swinging doors into the ballroom, her mind was already at war with itself. On one side was her mother's voice begging her to stay invisible, to protect their fragile security. On the other side was her grandfather's memory, his gentle hand showing her those symbols, his soft voice teaching her their meanings, his insistence that some truths are worth speaking no matter how small you feel. And somewhere deep inside, Clara felt something stirring, a courage she didn't know she had, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this was a moment that mattered more than safety. The tension in the ballroom had thickened like storm clouds gathering before thunder. The keynote address was supposed to begin soon, and it was becoming painfully obvious that Dr. Finch's grand revelation was falling apart. Clara watched from a distance as the famous polyglot argued in hushed, frantic tones with his colleagues. His face was flushed, his silver hair no longer perfectly arranged, and his voice had lost its commanding edge. The other scholars looked equally desperate. This was supposed to be a triumph, a breakthrough that would make headlines and secure their reputations. Instead, they were stuck, unable to make sense of symbols that refused to cooperate with their theories. Dr. Marcus Thorne, the younger scholar with nervous energy, wrung his hands anxiously. "The symposium's sponsor is expecting something groundbreaking," he said, his voice tight with stress. "The press is here. Photographers, journalists, everyone is waiting. If we can't even translate a single phrase, this entire event becomes a failure." Dr. Finch snapped back, his patience evaporating. "I will handle it, Marcus. My reputation is built on solving the unsolvable. I'm not about to let a few stubborn symbols destroy everything I've worked for." But even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his eyes. He paced in tight circles, his frustration palpable, and then his gaze swept across the room, searching for something, anything to redirect attention away from his own inadequacy. And that's when his eyes landed on Clara. She had placed her tray down on a nearby table, unable to resist moving closer to the screen again. Her small face was scrunched in concentration as she studied the symbols, her lips moving silently as if she were reading words only she could see. To Dr. Finch, she was nothing more than a servant girl, someone so far beneath his level that she barely registered as human. But in that moment, she became useful to him in a different way. She became a target, a convenient distraction that could deflect attention from his failure. A cruel smile spread across his face, and he strode toward her with purposeful steps, his voice rising loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Well, he announced, his tone dripping with mockery. "It seems we have an unexpected expert among us. The serving girl appears to be deeply fascinated by our little puzzle." He stopped directly in front of Clara, towering over her small frame, and the entire ballroom fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Clara felt her stomach drop as hundreds of eyes focused on her, and she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the floor. "Tell me, child," Dr. Finch continued, his voice theatrical and condescending. "You've been staring at this tablet so intently. Perhaps you'd like to share your insights? Maybe you've cracked the code that has stumped the world's finest linguistic scholars." Laughter rippled through the audience, uncomfortable and awkward, but laughter nonetheless. Clara's face burned with humiliation, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She looked desperately for her mother, but Helen was still in the kitchen, unaware of what was happening. Clara was alone, standing in a spotlight she never asked for, facing a man whose ego was so fragile that he needed to humiliate a child to protect it. A voice cut through the tension, sharp and disapproving. "Leave her alone, Alistair." It was Professor Eleanor Vance, an older woman with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. "This is beneath you," but Dr. Finch ignored her, crouching down to Clara's level with exaggerated patience, his smile widening. "On the contrary, Eleanor," he said smoothly, "I'm simply being open-minded. After all, in our field we must explore every possibility, no matter how unlikely." He turned his attention back to Clara, his voice a patronizing drawl. Go ahead, don't be shy. Tell us what the ancient stones are saying. What profound secret does this line hold? Clara's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to apologize, to retreat back into invisibility where it was safe. But something else was rising inside her, something stronger than fear. It was anger, not at being mocked, but at watching her grandfather's beautiful language being twisted and misunderstood by someone who thought knowledge was the same as wisdom. She remembered her grandfather's words spoken on a night when his eyes were distant and sad. Words are all we have left in the end, little sparrow. They're the only things that truly last. You have to protect them. And in that moment, Clara made a choice. She looked up at Dr. Finch, her blue eyes steady despite the trembling in her hands, and spoke in a voice that was quiet, but clear as a bell cutting through silence. You're reading it wrong, she said. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The laughter died instantly. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Finch's smirk froze on his face, his expression shifting from amusement to disbelief. What did you say? He stammered, straightening up slowly. Clara found a strength she didn't know she had. She lifted her chin and repeated herself, her voice a little louder this time. I said you're reading it wrong. It's not a map. It's a poem. Gasps echoed through the crowd. In the doorway of the kitchen, Helen stood frozen, a tray of pastries clutched in her trembling hands, watching in horror as her daughter did the one thing she had begged her never to do. She had made herself visible, and there was no going back. Professor Vance stepped forward, her expression no longer disapproving but intensely curious. She looked at Clara with new eyes, seeing not a servant but a mystery waiting to be unraveled. A poem? She asked gently, her voice inviting rather than challenging. How do you know that, dear? Before Clara could answer, Dr. Finch let out a bark of incredulous laughter, recovering quickly from his shock and wrapping his wounded pride in fresh condescension. A poem, of course, he said loudly, turning to the audience with theatrical exasperation. How foolish of us to bring in experts when all we needed was the literary interpretation of a child. This is absurd. We're wasting time. The girl is confused. Probably overheard us discussing poetic structures earlier and got mixed up. But Professor Vance didn't take her eyes off Clara. She saw something in the girl's face that couldn't be dismissed, a quiet certainty that spoke of real knowledge, not imagination. Let her speak, Alistair, she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. Tell us, child, what kind of poem is it? Every eye in the room fixed on Clara once more, but this time the atmosphere was different. The mockery had faded, replaced by genuine curiosity. Clara felt her hands trembling, so she clasped them behind her back to hide it. She thought of her grandfather, of the way his weathered hands had drawn those symbols with such care, of the gentle patience in his voice when he taught her. If he could face enemy soldiers in frozen mountains, surely she could face a room full of scholars. She took a breath and began, her voice growing steadier with each word. It's about connections, she explained, the way everything in nature is linked together. The first word, Kalen, doesn't just mean river. It means the spirit of flowing water. And the next part, too, means to be at rest or to sleep. It's talking about potential, the power that exists in stillness. She glanced around the room, seeing faces that were no longer mocking but leaning forward with interest. And the last word, Normith, doesn't mean mountain like you'd think. Nori is the soul of stone, the ancient memory that's held in rock. And math means to see while sleeping, to dream. So the mountain isn't just a physical place. It's a living thing that holds all the memories of the land. And the river rests so the mountain can dream about everything that's past. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of silence that comes when something true and beautiful has just been spoken. Professor Vance's eyes widened with recognition, and Dr. Thorne, who had been skeptical moments before, was now staring at Clara as if she had just performed a miracle. Even the reporters at the back of the room had stopped writing and were simply listening, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Clara continued, her confidence blooming as she spoke the words that had been locked inside her for so long. The full translation is, where the spirit of water sleeps, the soul of stone dreams. It's not giving directions or describing a place. It's expressing a philosophy, a way of seeing the world where everything has a spirit and everything is connected. A collective exhale swept through the room, and suddenly, the meaningless jumble of symbols transformed into something achingly beautiful. It resonated with a depth that felt ancient and true, undeniably authentic in a way that no academic theory could fake. Dr. Finch stood frozen, his face drained of color. He had built his career on being the man who could decipher anything, the master of languages who never failed. But here, in front of everyone, a child had done what he could not, and the simplicity and elegance of her explanation made his complex theories look ridiculous by comparison. "That's impossible," he whispered, though his voice lacked any conviction. "Where would a girl like you learn something like this? Who are you?" Before Clara could respond, a man in an expensive suit who had been watching from the side of the stage stepped forward. It was Mr. Davenport, the primary sponsor of the entire symposium, and his face was a mask of complete astonishment. "Young lady," he said, his voice filled with respect that hadn't been there for any other speaker that night, "please come with us." Professor Vance moved to Clara's side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," she murmured softly. "We just want to understand." They guided Clara toward a small conference room off the main stage, leaving Dr. Finch standing alone in the spotlight, his laser pointer hanging uselessly at his side. The great polyglot had been silenced by a whisper, and the symposium, which had been teetering on the edge of failure, was now poised on the brink of a revelation more profound than anyone could have imagined. The conference room felt like a sanctuary after the charged energy of the ballroom. Heavy mahogany furniture and the scent of old leather created an atmosphere of seriousness. Mr. Davenport closed the door, shutting out the buzz of speculation that had erupted among the attendees. Professor Vance sat across from Clara, her expression warm and encouraging. Dr. Thorne paced near the window, his earlier skepticism replaced by wide-eyed wonder. And then the door opened again and Helen rushed in, her face pale with fear and confusion. She went straight to her daughter, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. "I'm so sorry, sir," she began, her voice shaking. "She's just a child with an imagination. I don't know what she was thinking. Please don't hold it against her." Mr. Davenport held up a hand, his expression serious but not angry. "Mrs. Miller, your daughter is not in trouble. We're not angry. We're astonished." He pulled out chairs for both of them. "Please sit down." Clara sat, her small feet barely touching the carpet while her mother perched nervously beside her. Professor Vance leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Clara, what you said out there was remarkable. You spoke with a certainty that months of expert analysis couldn't achieve. You must tell us how you know this language." Clara looked at her mother, who gave a slight nervous shake of her head, but Clara had come too far to turn back now. "My grandpa taught me," she said quietly. "His name was Captain Samuel Miller." The effect of those words was immediate and electric. Professor Vance's eyes widened in shock, and Dr. Thorne stopped pacing abruptly, spinning around to stare at Clara. "Samuel Miller," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "The ghost of the islands." Helen looked confused. "I don't understand." "He was just a captain in the army. He served during the war but never talked about it much." Professor Vance's gaze was locked on Clara, a profound understanding dawning in her eyes. "Samuel Miller is a legend in certain military history circles," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "He was part of a special intelligence unit in the islands campaign during the war. It was a brutal, forgotten theater. His unit was crucial to several key victories, but their records were sealed immediately after the war, classified at the highest levels. There were rumors about an unbreakable code they used, something that enemy forces could never crack no matter how hard they tried." She paused, looking from Clara to the door as if she could see through it to the tablet displayed in the ballroom. "We always assumed it was some kind of mechanical cipher, like the famous code-breaking machines. But there were whispers of something else, something older, a native language spoken by only a handful of people, a tongue with no written grammar, no formal structure, a language that couldn't be broken because almost nobody outside the unit knew it existed." The pieces were falling together with stunning clarity. Clara spoke again, her voice steady now. "He called it the tongue of the silent mountains. He said the mountains taught it to the first people and they guarded it in secret. He was stationed near a village, and an old woman, one of the last elders who knew it, saw something in him. She taught him because she trusted him. He told me it was the only thing that kept his heart warm in that cold place." The room fell silent as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. The stone tablet wasn't an artifact from ancient Mesopotamia. It was a message from the 20th century, written by a soldier in a forgotten war using a language of metaphor and spirit that had survived in secret for generations. "Can you read the rest of it?" Mr. Davenport asked, his voice hushed with reverence. Clara nodded. Dr. Thorne rushed out to arrange for high-resolution scans to be brought into the conference room, and within minutes, the monitor on the wall flickered to life, displaying the tablet in crystal-clear detail. Everyone turned to Clara, their faces filled with anticipation. She stood and walked to the screen, her small finger tracing the carved lines with familiarity and love. "It starts here," she said softly. "It's a letter." And then she began to translate, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, channeling not just words but the soul behind them. "To the one who finds this, let these words be my witness. The winter has taken our fire, but not our spirit. The sunhawk has flown south for the last time. We are few now. The whispers on the wind carry the names of our fallen brothers." She paused, her finger moving to the next line. "Sergeant Peters fell when the snow lion roared. That means he died in an avalanche." They didn't have words for modern things, so they described them through nature and imagery. Professor Vance was writing frantically in her notebook, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Thorne stood transfixed. Helen held her breath, seeing her father in a new light for the first time. Clara continued, her voice unwavering. "Corporal Chen's spirit thread was cut by the shining fang, shrapnel wound. Everything is described through the natural world because that's how the language works. It doesn't have terms for weapons or war. It only knows earth and sky, water and stone, life and death as part of a greater cycle." She translated the memorial, a list of men who had died in that frozen, forgotten place, each one honored with a small poem that captured their essence. When she reached a particular name, Professor Vance let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Corporal Elias Vance," Clara read. "His stories were a warm blanket in the endless night. We wrap ourselves in their memory." Eleanor Vance stared at Clara in shock. Elias Vance was her grandfather. Listed as missing in action decades ago, his body never recovered. All her life he had been nothing more than a faded photograph and a name spoken with sadness. Now here in this room, she was hearing his final story, a message in a bottle that had traveled 70 years through time to reach her. The tears came freely now, not from sorrow but from a bittersweet gratitude that defied words. Clara finished the translation with the closing lines, her voice thick with emotion. "We leave our stories in the heart of the stone so that the mountain can dream of us. Tell my family I have gone to walk in the silent mountains where the rivers of memory sleep. Do not weep. A soldier's duty ends, but his spirit flows back to the land he protected." She looked down at the final symbol, a simple, elegant mark at the bottom. "It's his signature," she whispered, tracing it gently. "Samuel, who listens to the sparrows." That was his name in their language. The elder called him that because he was patient and kind. She turned to her mother, her eyes glistening. "He used to call me his little sparrow. That's why." Helen was crying openly now, silent tears of sorrow and overwhelming pride. Her father had carried this weight in silence his whole life, protecting these stories, honoring these men, and passing the language to his granddaughter so that someday, somehow, the truth could be told. Mr. Davenport cleared his throat, visibly moved. "This is the most extraordinary discovery in the history of this symposium," he said, his voice thick. "This isn't just linguistics. It's a piece of lost history, a testament to heroes we forgot." He looked at Clara with profound respect. "Young lady, you've given these men their voices back after 70 years of silence. That's more than translation. That's resurrection." The door opened and Dr. Alistair Finch stood there, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He had been listening from the hallway, hearing the dam of his own arrogance finally break. He didn't come to argue or defend himself. He came to witness what he had almost destroyed with his cruelty. He looked at Clara, at the tears on her cheeks, at the ancient wisdom in her young eyes, and at the respect on every other face in the room. "The language," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual confidence, "it's beautiful." It was the closest he could come to an apology, an admission of failure, and a genuine expression of awe. Professor Vance turned to him, her tone not unkind. "Alistair, we have work to do. We have a history to uncover." And she added, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder, "I believe we've found our keynote speaker." Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. But as she looked around the room at the faces filled with respect and gratitude, she felt a new strength blossoming inside her. It was the strength of her grandfather, the legacy of the silent mountains and the power of words that had waited decades to be heard. Her mother squeezed her hand, her grip now firm with pride instead of fear. For the first time that evening, Clara felt truly seen, and she knew she was ready to tell her grandfather's story to the world. The grand ballroom had been transformed. A single podium stood on the stage, bathed in soft light with the tablet displayed on the screen behind it like a sacred artifact. Mr. Davenport had insisted that this story be told immediately, while the emotion was fresh and the truth undeniable. Clara stood backstage, her mother adjusting the collar of her dress, the apron now gone forever, a symbol of an old life left behind. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" Helen whispered, searching her daughter's face. Clara looked out at the sea of people filling every seat, reporters standing at the back with cameras ready, and she nodded. Grandpa would want them to know. He wrote it so they wouldn't be forgotten. Mr. Davenport stepped up to the microphone, his voice filled with gravity. He didn't mention the original plan or Dr. Finch's failure. Instead, he spoke of forgotten heroes and sacrifices lost to time. And tonight, he concluded, that history has been returned to us not by a celebrated expert, but by a young girl who carried a precious legacy in her heart. It is my profound honor to introduce Miss Clara Miller. Warm, sincere applause filled the room as Clara walked onto the stage, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She looked at the tablet on the screen, the symbols like old friends welcoming her, and she began not with academic explanations but with a story. "My grandfather didn't talk much about the war," she said, her voice soft yet amplified by the microphone, "but he talked about the cold. He said it was alive, a beast that tried to steal your breath and your memories. The only way to survive was with stories. Words were their fire, their food, their only warmth." She spoke of the small moments of humanity that survived in the harshest conditions, of how a mismatched group of soldiers learned a secret language that became more than a code. It became their bond, their shared soul. She explained that the language had no word for soldier, only one who stands between the village and the howling wind. Their duty wasn't violence, it was protection, and they saw everything through that lens. She walked the audience through the tablet line by line, giving context from her grandfather's stories. The snow lion wasn't just an avalanche, it was a specific recurring danger the men had personified. The shining fang wasn't just shrapnel, it was a particular type of weapon that caught the light before it fell. Each translation was a brushstroke, painting a vivid picture of life and death on a forgotten front. The audience was captivated, hanging on every word. Dr. Finch sat motionless, his face a mixture of regret and fascination, watching the birth of something he had completely missed. "This section," Clara said, pointing to a dense block of text, "is where my grandfather honored the men who were lost. He didn't just list their names. He wrote poems for each one, memories to keep their spirits alive." She began to read them, her voice trembling with the weight of forgotten grief. Private David Chen. His laughter was a string of bright copper bells, the wind remembers their song. Sergeant Michael Peters, he stood as strong as the mountain's spine. Now he sleeps in its heart. Corporal Elias Vance, his stories were a warm blanket in the endless night. We wrap ourselves in their memory. Professor Vance let out a gasp, her hand covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Her grandfather, a ghost from family stories, was suddenly real, honored in words written by a brother in arms who had loved him. It was a message across time, delivered by a child who understood the sacred weight of memory. Clara finished with the final lines, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather came home, but part of him never left the silent mountains. He taught me this language so the stories of his brothers wouldn't be lost. He wanted the mountain to dream of them, and tonight, the whole world can dream of them too." She stepped back from the podium, and for a moment there was profound silence, the kind that follows something sacred. Then Professor Vance stood, clapping slowly, tears on her cheeks, and one by one the entire room rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous, not for an academic achievement, but for something far deeper. A tribute to the fallen, a thank you to the living, and recognition of a girl who had given voice to the voiceless. In the aftermath, Clara was surrounded by reporters, but Mr. Davenport and security formed a protective circle, guiding her back to safety. Professor Vance joined them, her eyes red but shining. "You've given me back my grandfather," she said, taking Clara's hands. "I've spent my life studying dead languages, and you just brought my own history back to life." Dr. Thorne entered, flushed with excitement. The story is already hitting the news, he announced. They're calling it the Sparrow's Code. This changes everything. Helen sat in a chair, trying to process the seismic shift. An hour ago, she was invisible. Now she was the mother of a girl who had rewritten history. Dr. Finch entered quietly, looking smaller and older. He didn't look at his colleagues, only at Clara. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice rough, "I came to apologize. My behavior was inexcusable, born of pride and ignorance. Your knowledge is a treasure, and I hope you can forgive my failure." Clara saw not a monster, but a man humbled by truth. "Thank you," she said simply, her forgiveness quiet and complete. Mr. Davenport announced the creation of a grant in Samuel Miller's name, with Clara and Professor Vance as chairs. The tablet would be donated to the National Archives as a national treasure. Government officials were calling to declassify related records. A new chapter of history was being written, and a 12-year-old girl was its author. Late that night, in a luxurious hotel suite, Clara stood by the window looking at the city lights twinkling below like fallen stars scattered across velvet darkness. Her small hands clutched the worn poetry book her grandfather had loved, its pages soft from years of reading. Everything had changed in a single night. She was no longer invisible, no longer just a servant's daughter fading into the background. She had become something she never imagined, a bridge between the past and present, a keeper of memories that the world had almost lost forever. Her mother came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and for a long moment they simply stood together in silence, feeling the weight and wonder of what had just happened. "What are you thinking about, sweetie?" Helen asked softly, her voice still thick with emotion from the evening's revelations. Clara looked down at the book in her hands, running her fingers over the faded cover. "About Grandpa Sam," she whispered. "I think he's finally at peace now. His brothers aren't forgotten anymore. Their names have been spoken. Their stories have been heard. He carried that weight for so long, keeping those memories alive all by himself, and now the whole world knows." Helen pulled her daughter closer, her heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Clara. So incredibly proud. You did something tonight that nobody else in the world could have done. You gave voice to heroes who had been silent for 70 years. Clara thought about that for a moment, watching the city below continue its endless rhythm, unaware that history had just been rewritten in a ballroom not far from where they stood. "I didn't do it alone," she said quietly. "Grandpa Sam did the hard part. He learned the language. He honored his friends. He kept the story safe. He taught me because somehow he knew, maybe not consciously but somewhere deep down, he knew that someday those words would need to be spoken again. I was just the messenger." Her mother shook her head gently. "You were more than that, sweetie. You were brave. You spoke up when everyone expected you to stay silent. You stood your ground when a powerful man tried to humiliate you. That took courage that most adults don't have." The next morning brought a whirlwind that would change their lives forever. News of the Sparrow's Code had spread across the globe overnight. Television stations were running the story. Newspapers were printing headlines about the forgotten war and the girl who uncovered its secrets. Social media exploded with discussions about endangered languages, military history, and the importance of listening to voices that society often ignores. Clara's face was suddenly everywhere, though she barely recognized herself in the photographs. She looked older somehow, more serious, like the weight of what she carried had aged her beyond her 12 years. Helen's phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, offers from publishers who wanted to turn the story into a book, and messages from universities inviting Clara to speak. It was overwhelming and terrifying and exciting all at once. Within days, their lives had transformed completely. Helen quit her job at the hotel, no longer needing to scrub floors and serve tea to make ends meet. They moved from their cramped apartment into a comfortable townhouse with a garden where Clara could sit and read under the shade of an old oak tree. Money wasn't a concern anymore. The Samuel Miller grant came with a generous stipend for its chairs, and speaking engagements brought in more than Helen had earned in years of exhausting labor. But more than the material changes, something deeper had shifted. Helen no longer felt the need to make herself small, to apologize for existing, to teach her daughter that invisibility was safety. They had been seen, truly seen, and the world had responded not with cruelty but with respect and gratitude. Clara threw herself into the work that had chosen her. With Professor Vance as her mentor and partner, she spent long hours at the National Archives, carefully translating every line of the Miller's Stone, as it had come to be known. Each symbol revealed more stories, more memories, more pieces of a puzzle that historians had believed was lost forever. They worked with government officials to declassify military records related to her grandfather's unit, and with each file they opened, the picture became clearer. The tongue of the Silent Mountains wasn't just a code. It was a lifeline, a spiritual connection that had kept desperate men sane in conditions that would have broken them otherwise. The language had given them a way to see their suffering as part of something larger, something sacred, and that perspective had saved their souls even when it couldn't save their lives. Professor Vance became like family to Clara and Helen. The three of them would sit together in the archive's research room, surrounded by documents that smelled of age and secrets, piecing together stories that deserved to be told. Eleanor shared memories of her grandmother, who had never stopped mourning the young husband who disappeared in the frozen islands. She told Clara about the poetry Elias had written before the war, full of imagery about nature and connection, and how his description on the tablet captured exactly who he had been. Finding that final message from him had healed something in Eleanor that she didn't even know was broken. It was like receiving a letter from a ghost, she said one afternoon, tears in her eyes but a smile on her face. I spent my whole career studying how people communicate across time, and then I discovered that my own grandfather had been speaking to me all along. I just needed the right translator. The Samuel Miller Grant became one of the most prestigious in the field of endangered language preservation. Applications poured in from around the world, linguists and anthropologists proposing projects to document and save languages that were down to their last few speakers. Clara sat on the selection committee alongside Eleanor, Mr. Davenport, and even Dr. Finch, who had undergone a profound transformation. The humbling experience had stripped away his arrogance and revealed a genuine passion for the work that had been buried under layers of ego. He became one of Clara's strongest advocates, using his fame and connections to promote the grant and its mission. In meetings, he would defer to her insights, recognizing that true understanding came not from collecting languages like trophies, but from honoring the souls they represented. They funded projects that captured not just grammar and vocabulary, but songs, stories, jokes, and dreams. Clara argued passionately that a language without its culture was just a skeleton without flesh, and the committee listened. They supported a young researcher who wanted to live with the last speakers of a nomadic language in Siberia, recording their oral traditions before they vanished. They funded a digital archive for a coastal dialect in Ireland, preserving the unique way fishermen spoke about the sea as if it were a living relative. Each project they approved was a small victory against the silence that threatened to swallow so much of humanity's diversity. Months passed, and spring came to Washington with cherry blossoms painting the city in shades of pink and white. Clara stood in her small office at the National Archives, which had become her second home, looking out at the petals drifting like snow on the breeze. She was 13 now, though sometimes she felt both much older and much younger than her years. The weight of responsibility sat comfortably on her shoulders, no longer a burden but a purpose that gave her life meaning and direction. On her desk sat photographs of her grandfather in his uniform, young and serious, and beside them, the original translations she had written in her careful handwriting. Every day she came here to continue the work he had started, ensuring that the voices of the Silent Mountains would never be silent again. Eleanor knocked on the door, her face bright with news. Clara, the latest batch of declassified files just arrived. There are personal letters from the men in your grandfather's unit, things they wrote but never got to send home. Clara's heart leaped. Those letters would be filled with private thoughts, final messages to loved ones who had never received them. Together they spent the rest of the day reading, translating, and occasionally crying over words that had waited 70 years to reach their intended recipients. They found a letter from Sergeant Peters to his sister, telling her about the beauty of the northern lights dancing over the frozen mountains. They discovered Corporal Chen's message to his parents, thanking them for teaching him to find joy even in hardship. And they found more from her grandfather, letters that revealed a thoughtful, philosophical man who saw poetry in survival and dignity in suffering. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Clara and Helen walked along the reflecting pool near the Lincoln Memorial. The water mirrored the sky, turning it into a canvas of orange and purple, They walked in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about how far they had come and how much had changed. Clara thought about the girl she had been just months ago, frightened and invisible, convinced that her place in the world was to serve silently and never be noticed. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. The journey from invisibility to voice had been terrifying and exhilarating, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. "Mama," Clara said suddenly, stopping to look at the water, "do you think Grandpa Sam knew? Do you think he understood that teaching me the language would lead to all of this?" Helen considered the question carefully, watching the light play across the water's surface. "I think he knew that truth has a way of demanding to be heard," she said finally. "Maybe he didn't know exactly how or when, but I think he trusted that if he passed the language to someone who loved him, someone who would treasure it, then someday it would find its way back into the world where it belonged. He chose you, Clara. Out of everyone, he chose you to be the keeper of those words, and he was right to trust you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from gratitude. She had been given an extraordinary gift, not just the language itself but the opportunity to honor her grandfather's memory by finishing the work he couldn't complete. She thought about all the families who had received closure because of the translations, all the names that had been restored to honor, all the stories that would now be taught in schools and remembered in ceremonies. The silent mountains had finally spoken, and their message had resonated around the world. "You know what the strangest part is?" Clara said softly. "I used to think being invisible was the only way to be safe. I thought if people noticed me, something bad would happen. But it turns out that being invisible was actually the most dangerous thing, because it meant my voice didn't matter, my knowledge didn't count, and I was teaching myself that I wasn't worth being heard." Helen hugged her daughter tightly. "You are always worth being heard, sweetie. Always. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to hide. I was so afraid of losing what little we had that I taught you fear instead of courage. But you found your courage anyway, and you changed not just our lives but countless others." Clara hugged her mother back, feeling the strength in that embrace, the unbreakable bond between them. "We both found our courage," she said. "You let me speak even though you were terrified. That's just as brave as anything I did." As darkness settled over the city and stars began to appear in the sky above, Clara thought about tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would come after. There was so much work still to do, so many more files to translate, so many more stories to uncover and share. The Millerstone had been just the beginning, a doorway that opened into a vast landscape of forgotten history waiting to be explored. She thought about the children who would grow up learning about Captain Samuel Miller and his unit, who would be taught that heroism wasn't just about battles won, but about preserving dignity and humanity in the face of overwhelming darkness. She thought about the endangered languages that would be saved because people finally understood that every tongue lost was a unique way of seeing the world that could never be recovered, and she thought about her grandfather, imagining him in whatever place souls go after death, finally at rest because his duty was complete. The mountain was dreaming of him now, just as he had written, and that dream was being shared by millions of people who had never known his name before but would never forget it now. Clara knew with absolute certainty that her life had been forever changed by a single moment of courage, by the choice to speak up when everything in her world told her to stay silent. She had learned that the most powerful truths often live in the quietest hearts, waiting for someone brave enough to give them voice. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that everyone has value no matter how invisible society makes them feel, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because the stories we share here matter. They're about real courage, real sacrifice, and the extraordinary things that happen when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who feels overlooked or underestimated. Drop a comment telling me what part of Clara's journey resonated most with you. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need them, and together we're building a community that believes everyone's voice deserves to be heard. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are never as invisible as you think you are. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.